So first thing first, how are you, Maarja?
I'm well, thank you.
That's good. That's good to hear. Okay. So before we get into the music you've been making, I'd like to go back to the beginning. Do you have a first musical memory?
It's hard to pick one because I have quite a lot of musical memories from my early childhood. My mother was a choir conductor. So I was hanging around in the rehearsals and we had a piano at home, so she was often playing the piano. And also we listened to music all the time, I guess, really all different sorts of music. So I remember sounds around me since I remember anything. So.
What was the music that caught your attention when you were that young? Okay, was it anything? Pop music, Estonian music?
Well, as I said, we really listened to a wide variety of different genres. I mean, when I was born, it was still, we were part of Soviet Union. So you didn't have access to everything. But yeah, my mother used to play Bach and some classical music, but I was a big fan of Led Zeppelin also when I was really young, and Estonian composer Arvo Pärt, really different things, also folk music, yeah.
And well, you had a piano at home. Did you play it or did you kind of, that's not for me?
Yeah, actually the first ever song I wrote was on piano. I was 4 years old then, and it was for my rabbit. I was very smart. I only played the black keys, so you know everything sounds nice. And since then, after that, it took more than 20 years till I composed another song of mine.
Really?
So yeah, it's weird.
Well, in those 20 years then, because you pick up the violin, what was your, this might be too serious maybe for the age that you were, but what was your aim? What were you trying to get out of music?
Well, I mean, no matter how young you are, you always think that you know already everything. But obviously, you know, if you are a child, then it's hard to really have this strong feeling of what you're aiming at. I know that I was around 4 or 5 years old when I saw a violin on TV. An orchestra playing, and I was just putting my finger and saying, I want that. So I got a violin as a birthday present, I think a year later or something, and went to music school when I was 7. I was sure that I would become, how do you say it in English, Egyptian, you know, like archaeologist, but working with the pyramids, and I was just reading all the history books. Maybe, I don't know. And yeah, I mean, I played music, and it was sort of just there all the time. I of course had my difficult moments because you need to work, you need to practice. And when I was 12, I won music school competition, which meant that I was offered to go to boarding school in Tallinn, where they train professional musicians. And that's sort of the step that when you decide, okay, I'm going to be a professional. But you know, when you are 12, I was just thinking, wow, I can go to a big city alone. And I said, of course I want to go. So I went there. But the moment when I really found music for myself and this really deep urge to create something, I think that was when I was around 21, after I had spent 7 months in New Delhi studying Hindustani classical music.
Because that, I mean, I'm not an expert, so I don't, but that's a big difference in kind of the music that I suppose you were taught in boarding school, and then that kind of, so what was that like to kind of figure that out, that this is what you wanted to do?
I mean, it's still an ongoing process, to be honest. And yeah, I studied violin, classical violin, and on the side I started to play folk music or world music when I was around 15 years old. I attended all sorts of different international youth camps, and that was my, how do you say, like the ventile, you know. Otherwise you would have to practice this Mozart violin concerto, and then you could go and improvise, even though I was freaked out when somebody said play a solo, because, you know, my school was totally different. But yeah, I played all the time other stuff aside, and while in conservatory I got a bit too enthusiastic about practicing at some point. I had a really inspiring teacher from St. Petersburg, and I started just to practice like crazy and overplayed my hands. So I took a free year from conservatory, and then just by different coincidences, I ended up studying in New Delhi with Saskia Rauda-Haas, Hindustani music. And many people ask, like, oh, did you study Indian violin there? And no, I didn't study Indian violin, I studied music there. And I think that was really, I've had always really great teachers, but being there, I started to understand also my previous teachers, maybe from a different angle. And that's the place where I really learned to really listen. Because for 3 months, I just played 2 scales, you know, from morning till night. And it's really the place where you start to... I was constantly working on finding how to take really the maximum out of one note, or how many different ways you can play this one note. Really focus, really listen. And that sort of dedication creates love, I think, for sound and for music. You really start to search for it. So it changed a lot for me. At the time was really inspiring because the whole musical tradition there, I mean, the respect towards sound by musicians there, I think it's really, really amazing and important. So it becomes sort of something holy in a sense, you know. It's like you can think of spiritual things in many different ways. Some people go to church or some don't, but you really take care of something.
So for you, something kind of approximating a spiritual experience can be hearing a certain sound or a certain...
I wouldn't really, saying spiritual experience, it tends to get a bit esoteric, you know. Yeah. So, but I really just learned to listen, and that inspired me a lot. I mean, the whole world of sound really opened, and what always keeps you going is if you don't see the end, you know, or like you see something far away, but it always develops, you know. You keep on walking and sort of your goal gets the same way further away, so you are just constantly searching for new.
So was it soon after that you mentioned you didn't compose anything for 20 years? So was it soon after that experience that you started composing yourself again?
Yeah, in some ways. I came back and I went to study traditional music. I was working a lot doing research with older music, and with that music, of course, there's a lot of improvisation involved. For some years, my main focus was trying to understand that older musical language, because if you take something from traditional, from archives, it's a fixed documentation, fixed form of something. And one way is to just keep it in that fixed way, but then it's sort of dead. you can put it in different sauces, you know, and make it interesting, but still it's not really living. But I wanted to understand how that musical language could work, so that I learned the vocabulary, the grammatics, and then I can hopefully start speaking myself. And then starting to experiment with live looping and electronics, it has slowly led to a situation where now most of the music is fully my compositions.
I can assume going into kind of that type of mindset, because there's that classical background that you have, very, very strict, I suppose, very, very, you have to play the note, like you say, you have to play the note, it has to be perfect. So going into a more loose, more, like you say, improvisational type of playing, was it more enjoyable?
Of course, I mean, for me, people are different. So
Right.
I did quite a few projects in different orchestras also while I was studying, and you know, I always ended up just improvising in Beethoven's symphony or something, another note. You know, I couldn't keep myself. Just playing always the same, but at the same time, it doesn't mean that I like to play around all the time. You know, I'm pretty serious person. So even if I improvise, I've created my own frame just where I move. So for me, it's very, very important to feel that freedom when I play a concert, and even if it's sort of the same program, it's really never the same. So I've created a frame inside where I move, but the combinations, how I do something, can be very varied. And that's what I need to exist, I think, really, to have this feeling of recreating something all the time.
So do you remember that first song that you wrote, kind
Yes.
of in that way?
Well, the first ever song I created with a looper, because I think the looper really was one of the triggers for me to start experimenting and expanding my sound world. Is an evening lullaby, Veere, veere, päevakene. It's an old, very old traditional singing melody on a riff and different harmonies. And I remember when I created this sort of harmony with a looper, I created it, oh, it sounds very beautiful, and then I think I looped it for about 2 months because I felt stuck immediately. As you know, when you loop something, okay, you make something nice, you make a second layer, a third layer, and then what? You fade it out or you just cut it, you know. It felt immediately sort of limiting, or like somebody is strangling you, you know. So, and then I tried to figure out how to use a looper in a way that I wouldn't feel too much controlled, I don't know, you know, like fixed. So I started to use these different rhythmical patterns, creating sometimes a very long loop, let's say like 13 beats. And then I create a second layer, which is like 21 beats. So they are not the same length.
Right.
And maybe then I sing on top of it a phrase that has like 6 beats. So it means that every time I start the melody again, the layers how they are not on the same point, you know. Right. So each time it comes back, it becomes a little different. So I created some sort of a system. I have some numbers that I often use, which I wasn't aware of, but discovered it only later when I had to sort of give a lecture about how I use live looping, and then I discovered that it's just full of these mathematical patterns. I hated mathematics when I was in school, so that's weird.
But it's interesting how that then kind of turns out that way.
Exactly.
That you notice that your mind is maybe subconsciously looking for these patterns.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's an obvious connection also with my studies in India, because the way how they use rhythms there, you know, there's a period of 16 beats and then they create rhythms inside it and patterns and they improvise. So I think it's a very strong influence from there. Okay. Also with a combination of older traditional dance music, which is not very quadrat. The meter is changing depending on which angle you look at it. So I used all these different elements and started to use it while looping. And that suddenly, again, opened a new world, how to use technology and sort of like how to trick the machine.
And you mentioned your voice. At what point in this, so we've talked about kind of the whole process, but at what point did your voice come in? Did you already sing when you were 6 years old, or did it come later?
Much later. Okay. Around 10, 12 years ago, I did music for a theater performance. And I was supposed to play violin there. And then suddenly the director said that he wants me to sing. And I said, like, no way, ever. And I lost that battle. So I sang there first time. I mean, many people ask, how can you play violin and sing at the same time? And the reason was actually really simple. I was too scared to sing alone. And as I had played violin my whole life, then if I was playing it at the same time, I felt a bit more secure. So that's actually how I learned to, I never took any singing lessons. I just started to sing with the violin. And then again, over the past, I think 5 years or something, it's one of the main instruments. I think if you look at the latest album now, I actually sing more than play violin. So that's weird. Yeah.
This might sound weird, but would you consider yourself a violinist, or are you a singer now as well?
I don't know. Those are just the labels. I mean, I'm just really interested in different sounds and textures. Also on the album, I play keyboard now, different synthesizers. So I just keep on searching for new sounds, and it doesn't really matter what tool I use. Voice, I mean, it's really, really personal.
Right.
So I've played violin my whole life, and even if I'm traveling somewhere where I'm not able to play for a few weeks, if I take it in my hands, it's still sort of okay, and I can give a concert, you know. But with singing, I mean, it's, you have a really bad day or bad time, you can't hide anything. I mean, this is really the soul coming out in some ways, and maybe that's why it's also more powerful often.
Well, with that in mind then, how important are the lyrics, the words for you then?
They are really important because, I mean, I need to believe in what I sing about or say. And yeah, I would never sing a song which has a cool melody, but if the lyrics, if I find them, I don't relate to them, then that's about it, you know. I might use the melody, but all the lyrics till now that I've used, they are traditional. That's the really traditional part, and I just think they are so cool because with these songs that you can't really even date back, you know, the texts come from 1,000 years back or something, and they've been filtered through so many generations that you can really feel that there's the essence, you know. You can't make them better. And it's a very beautiful language. Many things are said through metaphors. nothing too directly, you know, just like hinting from here and here. And it's sort of constantly on the borderline. They're very, very poetic. So also very mysterious, sometimes pretty dark and grim, but that's part of life too, so yeah.
Being now, for instance, now in Groningen, you're playing a show here, and then I don't think a lot of people in the crowd might speak Estonian. So what have you found how people react to the music and to the kind of what you do?
Well, if I sing a song with lyrics, then I always give some sort of a context. It's not that I start translating the lyrics, but I use this minimal storytelling and give some sort of a hint or basis what it's about. You can't even translate it too directly because they're so vague, but just to give a feeling, and I think it really helps to create a context for listeners.
Finally, then, I have to mention your friend, Ruum.
Hendrik, yeah, Ruum.
Hendrik. You mentioned the synthesizers and looking for these other sounds and textures. How has he kind of helped you in that search?
Well, he has opened the door, really, and I really, really enjoy working with him because I think the way how he approaches to Ruum, which is connected to his name, and texture, different textures, I find it really interesting and a good fit where I sort of aim at. It's interesting that I mean, I had for quite some time I had this idea with working with somebody from electronic field, and I sort of imagined the sound, but didn't have any idea, you know, how it's actually going to work out or what is it, you know. And then when we started working with Hendrik, then I was just okay, but that's it, you know. So
That's
yeah.
that was very good.
Yeah.
Finally, then, your own album came out in 2016. Shifter, which is the album you did together.
Now, yeah.
What are you working on now? Is it still this kind of cycle, or is your mind already?
Yeah, that's always tricky, you know. When the album comes out, then usually the artist is already, you know, moving. I've got quite a few different ideas going on in my mind, but as the album came out in October only, we are really in the middle of touring with it, and the main focus is now to sort of develop that same material. I think if you listen to the album, I mean, that's, again, it's a documentation of a certain moment. And if you come to a concert, it's a pretty big difference. Many of the compositions have taken a totally different turn or developed further. Some we've left aside and created new. So it's more like really this concept of muunduma or shifting in English. So we take this material and really sort of chew it now and create something new.
Very good. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.